Here are 2 things you must know for the ACT Science section. First, don't be intimidated by the fact that it's called the Science section. You actually don't need to know any science. It's really just about chart and graph interpretation. Second, don't read the passages. You will almost never need to use all the information that's presented there. Quickly skim to figure out the topic and just map where all the information is, then immediately go to the questions. You can use the questions and answers as a guide for finding information in the passage. If you have a specific question about the ACT Science section, leave it in the comments. Hey, it's Rose, and I'm going to explain level of difficulty on the ACT Science section. There are 3 types of passages on the science section. The easiest is data representation, and there are 2 of these. Then there's experiment studies, and there are 3 of those. And finally, there's conflicting viewpoints, of which there is 1. Now let's open the book and take a look at some examples. Here's an example of a data representation passage. We know it's data representation because it's mostly charts and graphs. This is an experiment studies passage, and we know it's experiment studies because it says experiments or studies. Finally, we have conflicting viewpoints, which is almost always exclusively text. So a good pacing strategy is to go from easy to hard. Start with data representation and save conflicting viewpoints for last. The biggest challenge on the ACT Science section is pacing. You have 35 minutes to answer 40 questions about 6 passages. The first trick to the ACT Science section is that you don't have to read the passages. You can just start with the questions and use them as a guide to find information in the passage. Second, use level of difficulty to your advantage. If you don't know about level of difficulty on the ACT Science section, check out this video first. Because data representation passages are the easiest, you should be spending the least amount of time on these passages. I recommend 5 minutes per data representation passage. Experiment studies passages are a little bit harder, and you should plan to spend 6 minutes per passage for these 3 passages. That leaves you 7 minutes to complete the conflicting viewpoints passage, which is the hardest passage and requires the most amount of time to complete. On the ACT Science section, it is easier to break the question into smaller pieces and find one piece of data at a time. For example, according to Figure 2, at 300 MPa, here's 300 MPa. The solubility of CO2 in rhyolite magma is closest to 2000 ppmw. Okay, so now let's mark 2000 ppmw on the y-axis. So it says, at which of the following temperatures? Let's find where the red and green lines intersect and draw a point down to temperature. The temperature here is 800 degrees Celsius, so the answer is H. On the ACT Science section, the easiest and fastest way to answer questions with double columns in the answer choices is to tackle one column at a time. This question is asking for which conditions resulted in the greatest absorption of H2O. First, focus on soaking time. Did soaking for 120 minutes or 270 minutes result in greater absorption? As you can see, 270 minutes was always higher, so we can eliminate answers A and B. Now, we've simplified the question because we only have to consider the remaining 2 answer choices. Finally, just compare 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and you can see that 50 degrees is always higher, so D is the answer. When answering double column questions on the ACT Science section, it is most efficient to answer one column at a time. So this question says, consider the units of measurement milliliter and lux in experiment 2. Which of the following phrases best describes the quantities represented by those units? Milliliter is volume of water, so we can eliminate F and G because both of those say mass. We don't even need to look at this side. Then lux, here it says that lux is light intensity, so we can also eliminate H, and the correct answer is J. Simplify this problem by tackling one column at a time. The problem is asking for the greatest mass of mulch. First, look at the key and mark the relevant points on the graph, oak and pine bark. Those types are always higher at 24 weeks, so we can eliminate 48 weeks. At 24 weeks, oak is always higher, so the correct answer is A. So on the ACT Science section, when you see the words increase or decrease in the answer choices, you should apply this strategy. So the question says, according to the results of experiment 1, as theta increased. So we're going to draw an arrow and have the top of the arrow be at the biggest number, which is 90. Okay. So as theta increased, what happened to the tension of cable 2? So we're going to go here and also draw an arrow, and we're going to have the top of the arrow be at the biggest number. Okay, so they go in opposite directions. So if this is increasing, because these are pointing in opposite directions, that means that cable 2 is decreasing. And that is how you do it. When you have an extremely wordy question on the science section, it is helpful to break the question into smaller pieces. For example, consider the statement when the total estimated number of cod, including both 1 to 3-year-old cod and 4 to 6-year-old cod, was relatively high. So on this graph, we're looking at this area. Okay, the mass of the snow crab caught was relatively low. That checks out. So are the data in the figure for 1984 through 1986 and for 1992 through 1994 consistent with this statement? Yes, it is consistent. Now let's read the answer choices. So yes, from 1984 through 1986, the mass of the snow crab caught was relatively low compared to the mass of the crab caught from 1992 to 1996. Yes, that's lower, so F is the correct answer. On every ACT Science section, there will be one conflicting viewpoints passage like the one shown here. Conflicting viewpoints passages can be identified because it's mostly, if not exclusively, text. Students usually find this passage to be the hardest and the most time-consuming, so save it for last. If you do have time to complete the conflicting viewpoints passage, this is how you should approach it. First, read the passage. That's the introductory text before the conflicting viewpoints. Then, read passage 1 and take notes on passage 1. Finally, read the second viewpoint and take notes on that viewpoint. After you've read all the viewpoints, you can begin to answer the questions, and this is where your notes will be very useful. On very rare occasions on the ACT Science section, you may be required to apply outside knowledge. Here are 3 things that you should know. First, the pH scale. Lower pH is acidic and higher pH is basic. Second, you should know the order of the planets. And finally, you should know the difference between a solvent, a solute, and a solution. Here's an easy way to remember the order of the planets in our solar system. My very eager mother just served us nachos. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. A helpful way to remember the pH scale is that acids and bases go in alphabetical order, so acids are lower and bases are higher. And remember that pH 7 is neutral. pH less than 7 is acidic and greater than 7 is basic. Using that fact alone, we can eliminate answers A and C. Look at the key. All the pHs are less than 7, so the correct answer is D. What do these 3 things have to do with the ACT Science section? A solute is a substance you are dissolving. A solvent is what you are dissolving into. And the solution is a mixture of the solvent and the solute. For the ACT Science section, you should know that protons are positive, electrons are negative, and neutrons are neutral. Here, we can eliminate A and C because the charge of a proton is 1, not 0. Exothermic reactions release heat, causing the temperature of the surroundings to increase. Brr, I'm so cold, because endothermic reactions absorb heat and cool their surroundings.